true friendship. We are to honor one another, be devoted to one another, and even be willing to lay down our lives for one another. Here's Gene.
A great relationship developed between David and Jonathan. 1 Samuel 18, 1-4. When David had finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan committed himself to David and loved him as much as he loved himself. And Saul kept David with him from that day on and did not let him return to his father's house. Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as much as himself. God wants us to get that point. He repeats it through Samuel as he recorded these words. Then Jonathan removed the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his military tunic, his sword, his bow, and his belt. And basically, for a prince, and he was a prince, the son of Saul, to do what he did was one of the greatest acts of commitment and dedication and love to a fellow brother that any person could ever do. Here we have an incredible demonstration of this principle. Now, one of the things I think we need to clarify is that you go to a more liberal interpretation of David and Jonathan, they will say, aha, there's your justification for homosexuality. There's your justification for the gay lifestyle. David and Jonathan. In fact, they can pick up biblical stories and read that into it. And the fact of the matter is that if you conclude that this was a homosexual relationship, then you're going to have to conclude that David was bisexual. And he was neither. David was not a homosexual. He did become immoral. The thing that set him off from many people who fell into sin was that when he was confronted with his immorality, he had a broken heart because he had a heart after God. Basically, what we see illustrated here is a deep relationship, a deep friendship, which I think is a picture of the church. If indeed the liberal interpretation of this were true, then David was absolutely ignoring everything he knew about the law, because the law definitely, very clearly condemned homosexual relationships, without question, if you go back and read the law of God. What we have, as I said, is a deep friendship, which I think is a picture of what God wants the church to be. Look at this. The deep friendship between David and Jonathan constitutes an Old Testament picture of a New Testament reality. The relationships God intended for believers within the church, the family of God. Look at the following parallels. Jonathan honored David above himself. As believers, we're told, show family affection to one another with brotherly love, outdo one another in showing honor. Between David and Jonathan, Jonathan served as a faithful intercessor. You're going to see that as the story unfolds. He was devoted to David, did everything he could to help David build a relationship with Saul. In the New Testament, we're told to serve one another through love. And you see a beautiful illustration in Jonathan of serving David. And then we have Jonathan continued to be faithful to David no matter what the cost to him personally, even if it cost him his life. In fact, his life was in jeopardy when he tried to defend David's absence. And in the New Testament, what do we read about relationships? This is how we have come to know love. He laid down his life for us, and we should also lay down our lives for our brothers. And so I think in this one-on-one relationship between David and Jonathan, we have a picture of what God really wanted to happen in our lives as believers, a picture of the church, the family of God. And so the question is, what specific steps can each one of us take to show family affection to one another with brotherly love and to outdo one another in showing honor? I think we have here in this beautiful statement from Romans chapter 12, verse 10, the whole concept of reparenting. People who've not had experiences of knowing what real love is. And as believers, we can reparent people by showing them what love is and reaching out to them. So how can we do this? What steps can we take? Number one is it's God's directive. We need to be obedient. It's the will of God. It doesn't say if it's convenient, do these things. It says this is the will of God. So we need to be obedient to the will of God as believers, reflecting true friendship in our relationships with each other. And then we need to act in what we know is right. If this is the will of God, then we need to act, regardless of feelings. Feelings sometimes have to follow. We act on what we know is right, and we look for opportunities to be a part of this reparenting process. And believe me, people need to be reparented and understand true love. I had the privilege of speaking at a retreat recently. And I was dealing with this whole concept of what happens within our society and our culture, particularly in terms of abuse, and particularly sexual abuse. And I shared a video clip of a friend of mine who was horribly sexually abused, even by his own parents, and the process that he went through alcoholism and pornography and divorces. And when God got a hold of him, his life began to change. His marriage was saved, and it's a marvelous story. And I showed that video clip. There's really a friend of mine who shares the story. He was very vulnerable in sharing the story. And in the final session of this retreat, there was a young man, he's probably about 16, came up to me, maybe 17. In a very timid voice, he said, I'd like to share with the whole group. And he said, what you showed, the story you showed, the vulnerability of that man has encouraged me to be vulnerable. And he was very timid in his approach. He had tears in his eyes. And at the end of the session, this young man shared. And he shared how, as just a young man, not too far back, his mother had become engaged, I think, and married a former prisoner who had been sentenced to prison because of his pedophilic activities, his sexual abuse activities. Had gotten out of prison, and she believed that he had changed. And then one day, because of the relationship, which is a horrible, horrible thing, and oftentimes sexual predators will do this, is use a relationship to set the stage for doing evil things, took this young boy on a fishing trip, seduced him, controlled him, and this boy was in a pathetic state of sadness and brokenness because of what this man had done. And as he came to me and as he shared with this whole group, he had the courage to share what happened. The man was now back in prison, and he had been in counseling and help. But the exciting thing for me, after, as sad as I was to hear this story, was to see the men in that retreat. One man who stood up and said, I can identify with what you've been through, and shared his story and how God had delivered him from the guilt and the pain of all of that. And then the other men that were there put their arms around this young boy and were fathering him, refathering him. His father, this boy's father, had died when he was just a little boy. He didn't know what it was to have a father. And then he got a, quote, father who betrayed him. But these men gathering around him, and then to see the tears flow from this young man's face. As he came back, he sat down, we were singing. I was sitting at that point in the back of the room. He was sitting right across from me. You see the tears flowing down his cheeks as we were singing a final song together as a group of men. You see, there's a lot of hurt and a lot of pain out there. And that's one reason why God has designed the family of God to be a reparenting organism, to honor one another above ourselves, to be devoted to one another in brotherly love, to help people, whatever age, to become the men and women that God wants them to become. They need our strength, and they need our courage. And so the principle reads, we're to honor one another, be devoted to one another, and even be willing to lay down our lives for one another. And that's a challenge, I guess, that's beyond most of us, but with God's strength, it's amazing what God enables us to do.